So just before we move on to the next section, wanted to do a quick shout out to all our live stream viewers watching this amazing summit from all around the world. And it wouldn't be possible without our live stream sponsor, RBC Wealth Management. So big round of applause for them. And next up, we have Changing the Culture of Business. Help me in welcoming to the stage Tony Profit, Chief Equality Officer at Salesforce, Susan Li, Chief People Officer at SeatGeek, Kiersten Barnet, Global Head, Gender Equality Index at Bloomberg, and if she's not still stuck in New York traffic, Rachel Sklar, co-founder, Change the Ratio, the Li.st.
Totally just blew up my spot. I'm here. It's all good. It's all good. Thank you so much. It's so great to be speaking on and moderating this amazing panel about something that is so important, still so under-discussed, and frankly, I believe redounds so significantly towards the bottom line. So we're just going to get right into the conversation. We've got Tony Profit from Salesforce, and Susan Li from SeatGeek, and Kiersten Barnet from Bloomberg. And we're just going to jump right into the conversation. If each of you wouldn't mind giving like a brief overview of what your role, your job, your role entails. A brief one, and then we'll get into the conversation. Tony, we'll start with you.
Great. Well, first of all, grateful to be here, and a super important conversation. And Salesforce is grateful to be included in that conversation. And so I am Salesforce's Chief Equality Officer, and the first of that role in the company, but really building on the work of many other leaders at the company that have been doing these things since the founding of the company about 20 years ago. And our team is really focused on the diversity of the workforce, building a culture that's inclusive, and then making sure that we're standing for equality, both inside the workplace and also standing for equality in the communities where we operate.
Great. Susan?
Great. Hi, I'm Susan Li. I'm the Chief People Officer at SeatGeek. I have to say, I was listening to the panel before, and I literally just texted my friends and said, I'm a fraud, get me out of here. So that panel was so impressive. But so I'm just going to put on my imposter syndrome hat and tell you what I do. So I oversee the people function. I have been at some various high-growth startups. Before SeatGeek, I was at Warby Parker, and before that, Spotify. And as the Chief People Officer, the functions that fall under me are recruiting, employee engagement, employee experience, anything that has to do with their organizational development, and just the overall well-being of our staff, and that touches so deeply with diversity and inclusion and equity and belonging. So I get to do all the great things. I think that I have the best job in the world, so, and I will fight you if you tell me you do. So, but yeah, that's what I'm doing right now.
Kiersten Barnet. I manage Bloomberg's Gender Equality Index, and under that umbrella is a standardized reporting framework that we built for public companies to voluntarily disclose metrics related to how they're promoting women in their workforce, in their products, and in the communities in which they operate. And then we also manage an index which tracks the financial performance of those companies that are doing this really well, which is also, happy to report, performing really well.
So let's talk a little bit about the corporate role of D&I, diversity and inclusion. And I guess we'll start again with you, Tony, because the role was created for you. So what was the need, the corporate need, the shareholder value need that was expressed in order to create this role? And or like how was it justified? Did it come from you? Like what was the impetus for it? Beyond sort of the fact that like we all know it's a social good. We don't have to prove that, but that's not usually what you have to prove in order to make D&I a priority. So I guess that's what I wanted to get at. How was it prioritized in the form of you taking on this role?
Well, again, Salesforce is about 2 decades old, just a bit over 2 decades old. And so these are things that the company really had been working on from the founding. And the idea that the company has a higher purpose to make the world a better place. And part of that is making sure that you have a diverse workforce that represents society at large and an inclusive culture. But as the company grew, it reached a stage where at the time the CEO and chairman, who's now the co-CEO and chairman, Mark Benioff, decided that he needed someone who sat at the table at the CXO level every day, who was their sole focus, was doing this every day, that was reporting directly to him. And so the role was created not necessarily for me, and I was fortunate to be the person selected for that role. And you think about what's the impetus for this. First is talent. So from a shareholder value perspective, the idea that so much about technology, and so many of the businesses represented here today, increasingly we're all technology businesses, that it's a lot about getting the best talent, getting the best people, and allowing them and fostering them to do the best work of their careers. And so if you're not accessing all the great talent pools out there, if you're not building a culture where people feel they can bring their full authentic self to work, they're not doing the best work of their careers. And so I think if you said what's the number one priority, it's about getting great people and allowing them to do great work.
So, Susan, I'm going to throw this to you. Whose responsibility is creating that culture? Is it a top-down thing? Is it consistent training across the board? Is there a responsibility that lies with employees coming in? Like, how does a culture of inclusion become fostered?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, much like Tony was sharing, like Salesforce, my career is 2 decades old. So I've been doing this for about 20 years, and we've been talking about this since I started, and I'm sure many years ahead. And I think what is both really hopeful, but also just kind of like shame on us, is that we're still having some very elementary conversations about it. But when we talk about whose responsibility it is, I think it is. It's everyone's. I mean, isn't it? It's like we've tried in the past to let it be a top-down. Companies have tried to have make sure that they have diversity programs. And I come from advertising. It was bred from the fact that our clients were becoming more diverse, especially internationally, and they were demanding someone who understood their perspective, which then leads to your workforce becoming more diverse. And then hopefully then your processes and practices becoming more diverse. But the reason why it can't just be top down or just can't come from your customer's voice or whatever is just that the world is changing. 10 years ago, we were not talking about just, I don't think the words gender fluidity ever crossed my mouth. It's like before it was male, female, then it was potentially male, female, other. And then now it is like, it could be none of those even. I think Facebook has this thing where you can identify, and they have over 51 options for which you can identify your gender. So, I just think the world is changing too. So it has to be everyone's responsibility, because no one person at any level of a company can have all the answers or all the questions.
Kiersten, from the data side of things, the Gender Equality Index actually is a measuring tool. Do you mind explaining a little bit about that, and also sort of how it's been received in the international corporate community, which everybody might not have the same degree of commitment to the issue?
Sure, no. I think in the past, diversity seems to be one of those things that was kind of graded on effort as opposed to results. And I think to some of the points Susan just made, for all these reasons, and Tony pointed out shareholders, you've got so many stakeholders now that are looking for actual results. It's not okay to just say we're committed and we're working on it. And that's your shareholders, it's your stock exchanges, it's governments, it's your employees, and people want to see numbers. And so I think that in general, transparency has become the new indicator of whether a company is taking this seriously. And one of the things that we're hoping our framework has done is change the conversation a little, because if you think about environmental data, for example, it's always been a little bit more socially acceptable to say, I'm burning coal now, but I'm going to get clean in 10 years, and here's how I'm going to get there, and that's okay. And yet, for some reason, with diversity, I think like when you look at gender, that's what I'm most familiar with our framework, but I think companies held their cards close to their chest until they hit parity, instead of having it be this safe place to say, okay, we all have a pipeline problem, none of us are doing this as well as we want, the goalpost is moving, it's an evolving space, to Susan's point, everything keeps changing, but the best we can be doing is measuring this and then reporting on it and learning from each other's both mistakes and also successes. And so the thing I'm most excited about the data is just that companies are actually measuring these things, because until you measure them, you really don't know what problem you're solving for. And just to give an example, at Bloomberg, we switched to kind of a data-driven approach several years ago, and up until then, I would say our D&I effort was well-intentioned, but not particularly effective, or certainly not as much as we wanted it to. And we said, well, wait a minute, everything else, we're a data company. Everything else we do is about data. Why aren't we doing it this way? And once we did, we saw things that we had made assumptions about that some were right, but some were very wrong. And we looked at, our engineering workforce, for example, has the lowest percentage of women as a whole, which is not all that surprising. And yet they're one of the few businesses that has a reverse pipeline problem. They have more women represented at the top and managing a huge percentage of that workforce than they do at the bottom. And so it's like, okay, well, what can our sales force learn from that team? And we're solving for a different problem there than we might be for our journalists. And so I'm excited that companies are taking that first step of measurement, because without that, you really have no way to measure progress or to hold people accountable.
And I want to underscore Kiersten's point of the importance of measuring, the importance of data, and that in the science of management, data is that fuel of that science. And so for us, and the importance of transparency, and that folks not just being transparent when they feel that they've reached success, but being transparent with all of their stakeholders along the journey. So literally right now, you can take out your smart device and go to salesforce.com/equality, and there's our data, and we're completely transparent, not because we think we're done, because we're not, but you can see that today, 31.6% of the folks that work for Salesforce globally are women. And likewise in the US, we're transparent about the underrepresented folks at the company. And so that's where we are. We don't think we're at success, but we've made progress. 2 years ago, that was 30.1%. And just this last year, that means in the last year, because we're growing at scale, more than 4,000 more women work for Salesforce this year than last year. And so, is that success? No. Is it progress? Yes. You can argue about the pace of progress, but the important point is about transparency, and Kiersten, to your point about the data.
So just to, I guess, dive into the numbers a little bit then, when you talk about overall percentages, that's one thing in a company, but then some of the roadblocks that can be experienced in a corporate environment come with promotion and ascension to the C-suite. So for anyone on the panel, really, what initiatives are companies taking to address that? Because that's where the disparity tends to show itself most clearly.
Yeah, I'll just start, but I think that again, we often look at what percent of a workforce falls in XYZ bucket, and that's only tells you one story. It would be like if you're Procter & Gamble and you said I sold $100 million of shampoo last year. Okay, but what markets? Who was buying them? What were the ad campaigns? What wasn't selling? Why? Those are all the questions you have to ask about your people. And so in our framework, we have baseline metrics around women at different levels. And for the US, we also ask about multicultural women as well. But we also ask about what's the percent in revenue producing roles or line roles? What are the percent of women working in engineering? Because those we know are going to be critical to the future of work. And what percent of your promotions that fiscal year went to women? And those are the things that you have to look at, and then looking against what your overall percentage of that population is. Because without that just knowing the population, really doesn't tell you much about the story or whether you're apt to make progress.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to just speak from kind of like the smaller company perspective, like a pre-IPO company who doesn't necessarily have like a ton of resources or a ton of open roles. That I think the difficulty is at a startup stage, one feels like a win. Like if I hire one female engineer, I'm like ahead of the game compared to some other companies, And what's different and challenging, especially in the technology sector and startup world, is that there has been such a systemic and historical problem. We were talking about STEM earlier in the panel before. We weren't pushing girls through computer science. So today, like if we just hired a new CTO at SeatGeek, and our employee base asked what was the diversity numbers of the panel, of the pipeline. So we shared it. It was not impressive because today there are very few candidates, female candidates, that are primed and have the experience, years of experience, to be CTOs. There are some, but because we have a systemic issue, it's not equal to the number of males that came through. Then those female candidates probably have 20 companies who want to hire them, because we're all trying to do the same thing, which then potentially creates a reverse gender pay gap because they're so sought after. So it is this weird dynamic of, we built this house, and we kind of have to figure out how we make it livable in this conversation of diversity and inclusion.
Well said, and you could say the same thing for underrepresented folks in terms of the pipeline. So at scale, the initiatives, it's again, back to the data and about accountability. So at Salesforce, Rachel, specifically to your question, so we have an initiative, a program, it's about 1.5 years old now, where every leader that works for Salesforce that has more than 500 folks that work for them, every 30 days they get a scorecard. What's on the scorecard? How many women work for you today? How many women work for you 30 days ago? How many women work for you a year ago today? In the last 30 days, how many women did you hire? How many women did you promote, to your point? And how many women attrited for any cause? And because, again, to your broader point, you want not just the broad cohort, but you want all the way up to the board, right? And our board of 13 folks has 3 women on the board. And that's in publicly traded firms, that's one measure of transparency, because you can always see their boards, right? We know you're the initiative's youth champion. So every executive gets a second scorecard. How many executive women, VP plus, do you have? Same litany. In the last 30 days, how many did you hire? How many did you promote? How many attrited? How many a year ago today? And so there's no mystery and there's no latency. Because if you're looking at this, once a year or once a quarter, then you say, wow, we had a problem last year. Versus every 30 days, you can see these trends emerging before they're problematic, and the opportunity to course correct. And so that's really the discipline that's driven and created this awareness among all of our leaders about where they're at and if they're proud of these data or not.
So sorry.
No, I was just going to say, to add to what Tony said about all of your leaders, I think that holding people accountable, it is important to do that throughout the firm, because you also think about the majority of hiring and promotion and advancement pay decisions are being made often in the middle. And so having all of your leaders, held accountable, and then having them hold their leaders accountable is really important, because just the top, as you said in the beginning of this conversation, that's not enough.
And I just want to kind of an add-on for something to keep in the back of all of our minds is, I love that this event is focused towards elevating women, and we're talking a lot about gender, but I think sometimes we tend to forget the intersectionality of what's happening in the world. So we may say women, but if we're also not tracking women of color or women from lower income, women without college degrees. I remember hearing this one thing, I was reading this whole article about how President Obama changed his point of view about affirmative action. He used to be for, and then he thought, I would never want my daughters to take an opportunity from someone else when they came from such privilege, and so kind of he was changing his mind on that. But one of the things he said was, it is actually, he was talking to a group of startup CEOs and entrepreneurs and founders, and he said, it's actually easier for a woman to make it onto a board of a technology company, which is actually a sad thing to say if it's ever easier for a woman to do that, but then a black man. So it is, I think it's important that the conversation includes that intersection of, we all come from many different types of, I guess, identifiers that it's not necessarily speaking for everybody when we put it out there.
You just reminded me of the stat that there are more CEOs on the Fortune 500 named John than there are women. And I remember a number of years ago, at one point, there were like 3 men named Peter on the Twitter board and no women. So yeah, that stat's well taken. But what I find interesting about, particularly Tony, when you talk about the methodology for making sure that sort of diversity initiatives are not only in play but transparent and observed, is that kind of cuts against the whole pipeline argument that we hear about, because while some sectors are certainly, there are a pipeline issue, like the fact remains that, for example, women get 2% of VC money and then even less for follow-on rounds, and I mean that definitely impacts who gets hired. And so with the pipeline issue, I'm just kind of curious, and I'm sort of put you on the spot. It's only this question arose when you started talking about that. Like, is the pipeline reason, does that come up when managers look at those numbers of their who stayed, who attrited? Like, is that, are people like, man, that pipeline, we just don't know what to do? Or is the methodology cutting against that as a reason that was formerly, acceptable across the board?
I'll make a couple points. You mentioned the VC world and some of the things that happen there, and lots of work to be done there. And there's a Salesforce Ventures. We have work to do, but proud to say we're an investor in Ellevate, right? And so
Excellent.
As an example, and
synergies.
And I also, in terms of full disclosure, right? And so, Sally's a hero of mine personally, and an icon in American industry. And so we're proud to be an investor and partner in Ellevate. In terms of the pipeline, in many industries, in the tech industry, that can be used as an excuse. And the time for excuses is over, right? So it's easy to say, well, there's a pipeline issue, and we're investing in kindergartners or middle schoolers, and come back and see us in 15 years. We are doing those things. So Salesforce is deeply invested in STEM and partnering with organizations, Girls Who Code, Code.org, those sorts of organizations that are doing great work for folks of underrepresented folks, for young women and girls, but that can't be used as we do not use that as an excuse, right? So the time for action is now, and we're holding people accountable, and we're not focusing on, well, it's a pipeline problem.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on this spot there, but it's sort of the conversation. I've been having these conversations for a while, and I couldn't help but wonder how actual processes in an actual company to actually care about diversity and inclusion might help things, and it sounds like it does. I want to switch a teeny bit just to move away from data for a second, because Susan, I know you talk about rituals inside a company and sort of like how that can help foster inclusion. And I think there often is a secret sauce that comes, the spark that makes a company culture unique. It's actually caring about these things, or how you care about your employees. So I'd be interested in you expanding on that a little bit, to talk about how that helps, or your philosophy on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have worked for brands that have no problem attracting young, diverse talent. What we found is, not to step away from the data, but we all love data here, that actually that diverse talent was turning at a rate of like 3x of anyone else in our company. They were leaving within 6 months. And a lot of it had to do with, yes, those conversations. I don't see people leading who look like me or who are talking the things that I'm passionate about. But there is also just that basic, that high school lunchroom mentality. It's like, I don't belong here. And so where this whole concept of rituals came in, I was giving a talk, and someone told me to talk about rituals. I didn't have a point of view at the time. And I was going through my Instagram, and I have all these pictures of food. Like, I'm obsessed with food, obviously. And I realized it's because when I was growing up, we had dinner at the dinner table every single night. My family did. It was just something my mom insisted we do because we were busy, and it was our time to kind of connect. And I just thought about that ritual of feeling like there was a place for me to belong and safely talk about what was going on in my day. And so I think where rituals come in companies, and it's this, when we shift the conversation from diversity to inclusion and belonging, which I think is crucial, because if you don't have your house in order, it doesn't matter who you're inviting to come sit at the table. I think rituals create this environment where people can find a sense of belonging. There's a very, very, very small example that it's like one of my early wins in my career when I was young, and it cost me $100 for this company that we did, but it was National Peanut Butter and Jelly Day. I think it's like April 4th or something like that. And I had this idea, and we went and we bought like every flavor of jelly, and fluff, and bread and peanut butter, crunchy, not, and everyone went to make their sandwiches. And you would hear these conversations of, you cut the crust, do you do diagonal? My mom did it in fours. It didn't matter if you were an engineer, if you were the CMO, if you were a person of color, if you identified as pan, it's like it didn't matter because it was something that everyone shared a conversation. One person said, I've never tasted fluff in my life, marshmallow fluff. And so it was just conversation where everything, whether you have or have not, where you were of the haves or have-nots, it allowed that conversation to be free. So that's what rituals kind of produce in a company. It's that culture of inclusion where anyone can participate and belong and can be a part of the conversation.
Absolutely, rituals. And so you think about at any organization, and at Salesforce certainly, what we're trying to create is a sense of almost like a family, the sense of inclusion and belonging, and that we're not always necessarily going to agree on everything, but we'll come together and we'll support each other as allies, like members of a family. And so, importantly, in a family, one of the essential things in building a family is shared memories. And so we have a series of rituals and events throughout the year, and one of them this season is Pride season. And we just encourage folks all across the world, dozens of cities across the world at Salesforce to show up, whether or not you identify as LGBTQ. Show up as an ally for your LGBTQ colleagues, your siblings, your brothers and sisters in this family, and show them support as an ally. And that notion that you see your colleagues showing up for you as an ally, it just throughout the next 364 days of the year, you're reminded that these folks are there for you as a colleague, as an ally. Or as the MLK March would be another example. And I'll share with just briefly, just one last one. But then we had folks in the company who were folks of faith. And they were saying, well, wait a minute, if your identity is black and male and heterosexual and cisgender, and that's your identity, what if my identity and my litany, faith is core to my identity? What about me? And we thought about that, and we founded an employee resource group in the company called Faith Force. And so the first ritual they wanted to establish was around at the end of Ramadan, there's a moment called Eid, where they break the fast. And he said, well, can we commemorate Eid in the organization, right? And we're saying, well, yes. And it became, that was last year, this year was the second time, where folks who identify as Muslim, inviting folks who don't, not to change their view about faith, but just simply to express, this is my identity, and this is why I've been fasting for the last 30 days, and you've been offering me cookies from the bake sale or whatever, and I've been turning them down. Well, just explaining their identity and building empathy, and that's now become, for the second year, a ritual of sorts, right, that we've brought into our family to make sure people can empathize with folks of all identities, and all intersectionally as well.
Kiersten, I want to bring it back to you because like when you're on such a granular basis, I'm wondering if that translates at all to your experience on the global scale. You are an officer at the World Economic Forum. You implement or track the index on an international level. I'm just curious if there's anything from from Susan and Tony's previous comments that like sparked anything in you, like that reminds me of that time at the World Economic Forum where we all had peanut butter. I mean,
when everyone was like petting cats or whatever they do in Bond movies. I think that the culture is the hardest thing to change, and it's also the hardest thing to measure. So not to bring it back to data, but I do think that, well, to bring it back to excuses, as we just, Tony said, there's no excuses. I think sometimes also I hear, particularly when we get into ethnicity, the same excuses around like, well, we're not allowed to ask that in that country, or we're not allowed to measure it in that country, or it's illegal to be a member of the LGBTQ community in that country. And those are true, and obviously we all have global companies that need to operate within the regulatory environments we're in, but that's still kind of an excuse, because I think that if you have the right culture of your firm, Bloomberg has 154 offices across 78 markets. And I always say that, you can go to any of them, and we're Bloomberg first, and then we are, Japanese second, Australian second, Turkish second. And so I think as long as you keep that in mind, that's important. Now, back to how do you measure culture and know that you have the culture that you want to have. I think that, some of the things we look at for indicators, for example, when you look at parental leave. So we ask companies about both primary and secondary parental leave. So that covers all of your employees. We also ask about usage, because not surprising, we often see that secondary leave, which not always but is often taken by men, is lower than what's given, whereas it's a higher percentage of usage for primary. And even at Bloomberg, I remember when we first added secondary leave several years ago, we kind of patted ourselves on the back. We're like, oh my gosh, our employees are going to love us. And then nobody was taking it. And the reason no one was taking it is because they weren't seeing their senior managers taking it. And so a lot of the men were like, is it a trick? I don't know. Are I really? And so they weren't seeing their senior managers taking it, not because they didn't want to, but because our senior managers weren't mostly of ages where they're having babies. And so we deliberately went out and had to get creative and say, okay, to the few that were, here, you're having a baby, you're a man, you're a senior manager, man. You have to take your full leave, which of course was no problem, and they were going to do it anyway. And then we made sure that, we socialized that, and that had a huge impact. And that was like 2 men. But they were visible men in our company of 20,000 people, and suddenly it became a safe thing to take advantage of. And I think that that's where you can, that is not a perfect measure of culture, but it is a measure of sort of if you are seeing that you have policies that people aren't taking advantage of, I do think that's an indicator of something in your culture that's sour. And that, if people aren't feeling confident or comfortable, whether it's parental leave or flexibility or fertility policies or really anything, remote working, anything else, I think that then that means that you need to work on that culture.
That's really interesting. I'm
plus one to everything you just said. Plus one.
All right, I feel like we have time for one more. Excellent. Okay, so this is just a question generally for all of you, which is, the audience is made up of people who are employees, employers, founders, diversity officers, anybody who's in the audience. What recommendations could you make for them to take back to their companies, whatever their role? And I just also, in making those recommendations, I do want to point out that often women and people of color and just anyone who would be advocating for these are often given unpaid work or sort of like unpaid consulting of like, what should we do? Should this be your responsibility? So like as an added piece of this question is how do you also go back to your workplace and make it everybody's responsibility?
I mean, I'll start with, I think that approaching these things as a business problem and with business solutions is the only way that anything happens. Because you can come back from here and say, I heard about this policy we need to have, and we need to be on all black campuses if we want to recruit, more black and African American students entry level, but then they all might get there and leave within a year because they don't feel like they belong, and none of these are just you check one box and it's a silver bullet. And so I think that making sure you're really delving in, whether it's data or culture or just from conversation, and making sure that you have the right people around the table to solve these solutions and keep going the next level, and then also keep your foot on the gas is really important. And I'll give you just one other example from Bloomberg that I was guilty of is I remember sitting around a table and we were talking about our lactation facilities, and this was probably 5 years ago. And we're talking about whether, or not we should have Bloomberg terminals in them, because does that encourage women to feel like they want to work, or is it helping them, that then they
totally helps with milk production.
Multitask, yeah. And we're talking about other things like hospital grade pumps and all this stuff. And also, I remember some of the people looked at me and they were like, I don't know, Kiersten, what are they like? And I was like, I don't have a baby. I've never been in one. So I think that we realized no one at the table had ever had to lactate. So I feel like, who are we to be the right people to be solving that? So even though it looked like there were women and there were young women, and so surely these must be the right people, I think just making sure you're really conscious that you are solving for the right people it sounds obvious, but it often doesn't happen. So I think just being really thoughtful is what I would say.
I agree. I mean, I think what's interesting is this panel here, despite our experience and what we're working on, when we sit here, we come from a place of privilege. So we are now in a place of privilege, no matter how we grew up or whatever, and so it's such a simple thing, but I would just encourage you, no matter what role you have in a company, is to listen. You have to listen, because we have failed. I think people in our roles in the past have failed. And it's why, if you guys know the story of Susan Fowler, she was an engineer at Uber. She had felt like she was in a work environment where she couldn't succeed. And she had gone to the company, and the company had not created an environment where she could be heard. So she went to the press. The Me Too movement, they went to the company. The company did not support them. They went to the press. Our employees are going to find a way to get the support they need, whether it's us who gives it to them or not. They want to, it's an environment and time where people are tired of being quiet. And so I highly encourage at any level in your company to be listening. Here's an example, a very small example. At Warby Parker, they have a genderized shopping experience. You have to choose female or male what to look at frames. It really is for marketing data on the back end. But our employees came to us during a hackathon to try to create an environment where you don't have to do that, because they said, actually, it made them uncomfortable to have to ask someone in the store, are you male or female? They didn't feel right about doing it. And it actually came from one of their coworkers was trans and had they, them pronouns. And it is just not something at a business level we ever thought about, ever. You know, it just wasn't something that was on top of mind. And it came to us, and we're just like, wow, okay, yeah, we need to start figuring this out. So there are just things that it's super important that we listen to what's being said. And I do sometimes hear HR people say, well, my employees aren't talking. I go, no, you're not listening. That, you know, you have to create that environment. The second thing is, and I know I don't want to break broken record, but I'm just a huge proponent on inclusion first, because I think what's interesting in large companies, like you were saying, you know, you do these ERGs and then someone says, well, what about us? Well, what about us? And there are so many identities out there that it's always going to be what about us. But on the flip side, what people tend to do is we have a POC ERG at SeatGeek, and I think what's interesting is what sometimes the conversation changes to is we don't see color, we don't see differential, like, you know, we accept everybody, and you literally just erased then everyone's identity, you know. So this. It's very difficult if we go diversity first to make sure that you who are XYZ has a place, and then you who are XPN has a place. You know, it's going to be a very difficult, taxing way to work versus, and maybe this sounds too Pollyanna, creating an environment where everyone, no matter who you are and where you come from, has the opportunity to develop, succeed, promote, become a leader. I mean, if that's your target, then you're going to include everyone. And I'm just a huge proponent of inclusion first.
No, well said, Susan. Kiersten, you know, I'd underscore all the points that you made. Last point, we haven't said much about this or anything about this yet, I think, equal pay. Equal pay for equal work. So if there's one thing to take back, and so at Salesforce, again, late in the journey of the company 16, 17 years old, two women leaders courageously go to the chairman and CEO and say, we think there's a problem. They had a hypothesis that there was not pay parity. And he empowered them to go off and get the data, and they got the data circa 2016 and found there was, in fact, a problem. At Salesforce, it was about $3 million. And so there was actually folks not being, and we made folks whole, and we do that now on an annual cadence. Go encourage folks to go get the data. Same work, if you're doing the same job at the same level in the same location, equal pay for equal work.
You know, if I could just add on the pay, if any of you are working on that in your company, one of the most common things I hear from companies reporting through our framework is, I can't report on pay because then that would open us up to lawsuits. Okay, well, so far, none of the companies that have reported have had lawsuits. They've actually been really rewarded, because I think, you know, true transparency, as we've been talking about, is about reporting the data you're proud of and also reporting the data that you know you have work to do on. And I think the more and more you have leaders in this market, like Salesforce, doing what they do and also saying, we didn't do it once, we had to do it again, and then you do it again, because you have to do it every year. If you're hiring more people and you're paying more people, then you have to keep doing it. I think that again creates that safe space that we're hoping it's okay to have one. In fact, if you're not being public, I think people are going to wonder why. And if you're saying you don't have one, no one's going to believe you.
And just one last adding on to this, a lot of companies have failed in this, obviously, and when I go back to that whole thing about listen to people, because they'll find a way otherwise, when companies have failed about this, actually governments now are leading the charge on gender pay, or, you know, pay parity. They're requiring it. They're requiring fair pay across, you know, many local governments are requiring this. When the government does shit,
We're keeping it real. Keeping it real.
So sorry.
You were saying
So
those
real.
shifts, right? Shifts.
When the
No
No
government does
imposters on this
shifts-
stage. No way.
The live feed just went
yes.
black.
there are youngsters here too. When the government does shifts before you as a company does it, it's really problematic. It really, you know you're too slow and you're behind the ball. So yes, just saying.
We have time for a few questions. I mean, by all means, we want them to keep talking. Anyone?
Okay. So these questions, just as a reminder, are
Fabulous.
actually coming in through social media. If you have a question, please post it to any social channel and just tag Ellevate Network and use hashtag Mobilize Women. So the one we have here is, what's your recommendation to get Wall Street analysts to focus on both money and meaning, both results and relationships?
I can take that if we want. Yeah. So for anyone who isn't familiar with Bloomberg, we are the largest provider of data to the financial community. I am so excited about what I am seeing as far as the demand for more ESG data and particularly social data. A lot of that is coming because you have the big asset managers, the BlackRocks, the State Streets, the Vanguards in the US and same in other countries, and you have stock exchanges starting to mandate either reporting requirements or guidelines. When there's money behind something, like, stuff moves. So I think that is exciting for me. The other interesting thing, and I don't know if that will come up otherwise today, but there's something really exciting happening with women in money right now, particularly in this country. For the first time, women are in control of more private wealth than men. That is largely because we earn our own money and because we live longer. And so that also is a shift, because now the financial services community, just like when governments do something, if you haven't done it, you're behind. The financial services community on a whole is behind, and suddenly these are their future customers. This is who they need to attract. We know that women want to invest in a way that aligns with their values. It's the whole reason Sally started this company. And so I think that is what's going to move the needle as far as how analysts, look at companies and what the financial services community is going to be looking for from companies. And in the same way, they're going to have to, hold that mirror to themselves, because these are their clients who are going to want to know what they look like inside.
Voice?
Okay, one more question. How can recruiters recruit differently? Are we training them to screen with inclusivity and look for attributes beyond skills and titles?
I'll take this one because we do it on a day-to-day basis, especially in engineering. I think don't hold precious old processes. It's like the way that recruiting has happened for generations is exactly the same, right? You send a resume, your resume has experience, education, you look at that resume, someone may love that you worked at Google, that you went to NYU. The question is, as a CX advisor entry level, who cares where you went to school? Or who cares if you've worked, if it's an entry level role, did you need to work at Google? So I think we have to break those old processes. And business is not the leader of that. It's actually recruiting. You can say, I've literally, my pipeline went down to 10% because you cared that someone had a bachelor's degree when they didn't need it for this role. Again, governments are actually trying to push this too about when it comes to even when the fair pay is, when you do fair pay, a lot of the question is, we pay people more because they might come from a different background, have more years of experience, for the same person doing the same job who didn't have access to that background. And what they're pushing for is, right, fair pay for that job, no matter what your background is. And this is very similar. That's the conversation you can push in recruiting is, what are we looking for in this role? As a recruiter, you can challenge them. What would a bachelor's degree bring to the role that someone else who actually had comparable experience wouldn't? Like if someone who was working retail and someone who had a bachelor's degree at NYU, I'm not bashing NYU, go NYU. I'm not from NYU, but anyways, but they're both applying for a CX, a customer service role. let's talk about who's going to bring the skill set and the competencies we need to be able to fill the role. So I actually feel like from a recruiter's perspective, you can and should be driving the conversation with the hiring managers about when they say what are those requirements and nice to haves in that very first kickoff meeting. That's where you need to start pushing. I don't think this matters. There are also practices right now where you remove the name from resumes. You actually look closely at take-home testing and all of that if that's accessible. So there are definitely ways, and then there are also really great partners out there that their specific roles and jobs in companies focus on building diverse pipelines. So I would do some research.
And I want to build, Susan, on what you said, that we need to be hiring for capabilities and not for a pedigree. And often when I'm having this conversation with folks inside the company, and there's whatever, X hundred people in the room, and I'll say, who here today actually used calculus today? Or anyone today had to quote Homer or Socrates? You think about what a classical education means and how little of that actually you use, where really it's about communication and collaboration and critical thinking and creativity, those 4 C's, more increasingly. To your other point, Susan, to build on that, is about in coding, if you have different ways of assessing, and they're subjective, about someone's coding competency versus using a third-party tool that is absolutely objective, we use HackerRank, is a much more objective way to take bias out of the process, rather than putting someone under duress at a whiteboard and you maybe asking them different questions and then having a subjective assessment of how well they did.
Sorry, there's just one other small piece of advice that I would, when it comes to recruiting. Companies are really getting better at talking about unconscious bias, since you just brought that up. And a lot of people say, let's make sure that the hiring team understands their bias, what biases they bring to the table. I would actually challenge, it doesn't matter what bias you bring to the table, just acknowledge that you have bias. Because I may say I have a bias against XYZ, well, this person is an XYZ, so I'm totally fine. I'm gonna be so fair. It's like, let's just make sure that we are admitting that all of us come with some bias to the table, so let's try to eliminate any situation in which that is going to inform our decision making.
This was a fantastic panel. Thank you so much. Tony, Susan, Kiersten. They love you. I just want to remind everyone, you can engage with us on Twitter, at our handles on social media, and around the Ellevate network. The hashtag, I just messed it up, but you'll go and see it.
Hashtag Mobilize Women.
Yeah, that's right. Anyhow, I'm going to stop while I'm ahead. Thank you so much. This was fantastic.